Hello my friends, welcome to my corner. A few days ago I posted a video on how I make my videos. So this video is the result of that whole process. I decided to talk about Lermontov because I believe that he does not get enough credit. Many people focus on Dostoevsky, on Gogol, Tolstoy, Chekhov, and all of those great names of Russian literature, but according to many people, it was Lermontov that wrote the first great Russian novel, and that is Герой нашего времени, or A Hero of Our Time. The first time that I read it, I went for the Oxford edition, and I really liked it. The translation was really nice, and another cool thing about it is that it includes an extra text, a little text by Pushkin on his experiences in the Caucasus, which is the region where this novel is set. So it's a really nice companion piece to the reading of this novel. But as you may know, when I reread something, I like to experience a different translation or at least a different edition. And this time I decided to go with the Penguin edition. Now, I do want to tell you this. This is not the latest translation published by Penguin. This is the one that was translated by Paul Foote. I really liked it, but I just wanted to let you know that there's a newer version available by the same publisher. And here's an interesting thing. This particular book that I bought, I showed it to you before in a book haul that I did on a bunch of books that I was able to buy for less than $20 because one of the bookstores nearby was moving. So they did like a 90% off sale. So this is the same edition that I showed you in that video, and I realized when I was reading it that it includes a note from the previous owner at the beginning and then at the end. So hopefully, if I remember, I'll share that with you in the bottom line section of this video. So let's look first at a little bit of context, the way that we usually do. A Hero of Our Time appeared in book form in the year 1840, but some of the tales, 3 of them to be precise, had been published before in journals. So we have an interesting publication story right there with this novel. Lermontov was in his mid-20s when he published this book, and he was known at that time primarily as a poet. Okay, that is something also that is interesting about this book. We have a novel written by a poet. The following year, in 1841, Lermontov died in a duel, so just like Pushkin. And if we want to look at a little bit of a timeline here of Russian literature and Russian fiction, we could say that Pushkin's Eugene Onegin, or Yevgeny Onegin, was published in, as a single volume, right? Now, it had been published before, but as a single volume, it was published in 1833. But that is a novel in verse. So we're looking at a different kind of animal right there if you want to establish which is the first real Russian novel. And then Gogol had published Taras Bulba, which is a historical novella in the year 1835. And Dead Souls was published 2 years after A Hero of Our Time. So we're talking 1842, just so that we can kind of visualize, the literary panorama in Russian letters. Now, when you think about the traditional Russian novel, right, if I tell you that, traditional Russian novel, you're probably thinking the image that you conjure up is of a brick of a book that kind of hurts your arms while you're reading it. This is a very different story too, because A Hero of Our Time is only 155 pages in length. And the interesting thing about it, one of many, is that it doesn't really have the structure of the traditional novel. What we have here is 5 stories, all of which deal with the same character. They revolve around a guy named Grigori Alexandrovich Pechorin. So when you read all of the stories, you get a portrait of this hero or anti-hero, as we're going to see. The first 2 tales are travel sketches by an unnamed narrator. We could call him Lermontov within quotation marks. And then after that, after those 2, we get in tale number 3, the beginning of Pechorin's journal. So we have a preface, and then the last 3 stories are directly by Pechorin, supposedly. So it's a very interesting structure, and we're going to explore it a little bit more in detail in a couple of minutes. In order to approach the hero, right, because this is a novel about a guy, right, it's the hero of our time, what I thought I would do is to share with you a couple of important things that I found in the preface to the entire novel. And the first one that I want to mention is this. The hero of our time is, my good sirs, indeed a portrait, but not of a single person. It is a portrait of the vices of our whole generation in their ultimate development. Our protagonist is despicable, he is amoral, but he doesn't seem to be like that on purpose. There is great ambiguity to this hero. This is something also that we are going to explore, the implications of that. And his main problem is that he's just bored with life. Okay, this is a novel about ennui. But at the same time, it doesn't seem to be his fault that he's like that by the way that Lermontov presents him to us. So that's one thing. And the other one that I wanted to kind of highlight from the preface is the very last sentence of it. Lermontov says, "Let it suffice that the malady has been diagnosed. Heaven alone knows how to cure it." So in other words, I am diagnosing the illness here. How to cure it, what the cure is, that's another story. I have no idea, right? But my job here is to present to you the problem. And that is what Lermontov does with a hero of our time. So we're going to explore the tales. There's only 5 of them, so we can go into a little bit of detail with them just to give you an idea what the contents of this novel are. The first one is titled Bela, and I'm going to go with the English pronunciation here for the title of this story, at least. This is a framed narrative, okay? So we have our first narrator, he's a traveler, and he meets a captain. The captain's name is Maximych. And Maxim tells the story of Bela and Pietchorin, okay? So in this story, what happens, the main action here is that there's a young man who becomes completely obsessed with a horse. And Pietchorin says, "I will get you that horse in exchange for your sister." So, I mean, already look at that. That is the first thing that we hear about Pietchorin. You can already tell what kind of a person he is. He is described as jaded. He is kind of the legacy of the English Romantic movement. So think a Byronic type of hero or anti-hero. We're thinking of Byron here as a major influence. Pietchorin is only 25 years old. And when Maximych meets him, he is just appalled that such a young person would have such a negative mindset. Okay, we're dealing with bored youth here in this novel. It's a main thing. It's a main theme throughout the text. The purpose of the story, if you ask me, of the story Bela, is to tell us a little bit about the hero through an event that illustrates his indifference and also his lack of scruples. So that is the first story. The second one is titled Maximych. So we have the name of the captain that the protagonist or the narrator meets. And we jump in time here to a moment when the narrator, the quote-unquote Lermontov that I was mentioning before, meets Maximych again by pure chance. One really nice thing about the hero of our time, one thing that I really like, is that it doesn't present a linear narrative. Okay, we jump back and forth in time. This is a text that is way ahead of its time because back then when it was published, this was completely innovative. Right now we're used to that, you know, but back then it was something completely different. So the narrator meets Maximych again, and guess who else just so happens to be in the area? Pietchorin, of course, okay? So all of them are converging in this place. Now, not much really happens in this story, Maximych, but what it does is to show us how detached a person Pietchorin is. For example, when he finds out that just by pure chance they have met there, he and the captain, he doesn't seem amazed at all, you know? And another thing that happens in this story that is very important is that we get a description, a physical description of Pietchorin by the narrator, the Lermontov, between quotation marks. So we are getting closer to the hero or anti-hero. The third tale is titled Taman. So after those first 2 stories, right, as I told you before, we get Pietchorin's journal. Okay, so there's a brief preface to the journal, then we get the journal, and at the beginning, in that preface, we are told that Pietchorin has died. This happens right in the middle of the novel, and it's not a really important plot point or anything like that. It's kind of like the excuse, the reason why we can have his journal in the first place. So I'm not spoiling the reading experience for you or anything. So once again, we go back and forth in time, and it's just a very interesting structure that this novel has. So let's go back to the title of the story, Taman. Okay, and in this story, what happens is that we hear about an event in Pichorin's life in which he stops at a place and he meets a deaf woman, a blind boy, and a singing girl whom he describes as a mermaid. In this story, what I was thinking was that Pichorin is a little bit like a Hitchcockian protagonist. He's just a bystander who is caught in a situation that he doesn't fully understand. That's what I mean by that. So he gets the opportunity to get close to the girl, the singing girl, the mermaid, but then something completely unexpected happens. Okay, and I'm not going to tell you what. I'm going to let you discover that for yourself. So that brings us to story number 4, Princess Mary. And this is by far the longest story in the novel. It takes up just about half of the entire novel, and it's also the most complex. Okay, it's the one that has great psychological introspection. That's what makes it important. And I would say that just this story, okay, of Princess Mary, this story by itself would have been enough to secure a place for Lermontov in a history of Russian literature, or Russian fiction at least, because he was already a very important poet. So in this story, Pichorin is at a mountain lodge and he meets an old acquaintance, a guy named Grushnitsky. The funny thing here is that, they're described as friends. He says, oh, I met a friend, and they just hate each other. Okay, it becomes apparent from the very start, and Pichorin says so himself. Okay, he doesn't like this guy, the guy doesn't like him. So we have a recipe for disaster right here with this meeting of these two acquaintances. And both of them are interested in different ways in a girl named Mary. This is the Princess Mary of the title. She just happens to be stopping there at the same place with her mother. At the same time, we have Vera, okay, and this is a woman from Pichorin's past. So an old acquaintance, somebody that he used to know. We can just put it that way, right? So you can see, once again, people converging in one place and then things happening as a result of that. Great entanglements, okay? Pichorin lets Grushnitsky get close to Mary, only to enter the picture himself later on and charm the girl. So this is what's going on there between them. I think, one part that stood out to me was, at one point Pichorin says, I love enemies, but not in the Christian way. Okay, there's great irony throughout this book. Lermontov was great at that. He loves enemies in the sense that he seems to enjoy conflict. He seems to enjoy playing the villain. Okay, and that's part of that idea, maybe stemming from that boredom that he feels with life. And when I was reading the story, another thing that happened to me was I wondered to myself, or I thought to myself, could we not consider Pichorin to be kind of like a precursor of Dostoevsky's Underground Man, in spirit at least, right? And then when I read some criticism, I'm going to share this with you in the second half or the last part of this video. One of the critics, John Garrard, pointed that out, that there was something of, Pichorin in Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground. So I was like, okay, so I wasn't that wrong about this whole thing or about my approach. There are some misogynistic comments in the story of Princess Mary, but if you ask me, the misogyny of Pichorin is kind of like just an aspect of his misanthropy. He seems to not like people in the first place. So how is he going to like women if he doesn't like people in the first place? And he's also very contradictory, because he will say something like, I love women, but then he will go with these comments, that are misogynistic. So we have a very complex person right here in the middle of this narrative. Plot-wise, the tension between the two friends, Pichorin and Grushnitsky, just leads to a very unhappy ending that I'm going to let you discover also by yourself. And that brings us to the 5th and final story in the collection, which is titled The Fatalist. This is a really short story, okay, it's very brief, and it's a philosophical tale. The main theme is predestination, right? Are our lives predestined or not? There's a man named Vulich, and he wants to prove that there is such a thing as fate. He plays Russian roulette. He survives, even though Pichorin had seen like the shadow of death on this guy's face, like a moment before he did this thing with the pistol, right? Now, right after that, something unexpected happens, and Pietchorin gets the opportunity to test for himself whether predestination is a thing or not. And that's when the story gets interesting. That's where the novel ends after this event. And it ends, but it ends in an open way, right? Because this is a collection of stories, and the chronology is like all over the place, in a sense. So I really loved that. I thought it was great. It was a really, really nice ending that did not seem artificial at all to me. It has that added realism to it, because you don't have that typical conclusion. You have an ending, but not a conclusion. We could maybe put it like that. So I told you I was going to share with you some ideas on some criticism that I read. And this part of the video, before we go into the bottom line section, it's going to be like an assessment of a hero of our time, and we're going to, resort to the ideas of some critics. The first one that I read is an Italian critic by the name of Ettore Gatto. I happen to have a history of Russian literature by him that my father brought me from Buenos Aires. It's in Spanish, in translation. And he says that Pietchorin is a descendant of Eugene Onegin, right? But he says, let's not overlook the differences, because they are very important too. One of them, just to give you an example, Lermontov goes much deeper into the psychology of his character, of his hero, but at the same time he remains more detached, in the sense that we don't have a third person omniscient narrator. So that's one of the differences that he points out. And the other thing that I thought was interesting from Gatto was that he says that Pietchorin is a very ambiguous character. We can agree that he is a bad person. He's a horrible person, right? But was he born or made? In other words, is he to blame for the way he is? Or is it the kind of society that allows this kind of monster to develop, right? So that's the ambiguity, and that's the double-edged sword that a hero of our time is, just kind of like Don Quixote in that way. So that's Ettore Gatto. Now we're going to go to a different critic. His name is Luis Gregorich. He writes in Spanish. I read him in Spanish also from a history of literature that my father has. So I was looking at the Romanticism volume. And I like the way that he describes a hero of our time. Gregorich says that a hero of our time is romantic realism. In other words, what he's telling you is that this is a great bridge, this novel, between the two schools, Romanticism and realism, which many people sometimes see as opposites, right? Realism was a reaction to Romanticism, just as Romanticism was a reaction to classicism and stuff like that, right? But in a way, they could also coexist. And you have some great books like this one. That's one of the reasons why I like it so much, where you can find the two things right there. Two key points that Gregorich makes. The first one, he says that there is great introspection, great psychological insights in a hero of our time, the kind that would later be taken up by Dostoevsky, by Gogol, and by Tolstoy and other great Russian authors. So that is one of the reasons why he thinks this is such an important novel. And the second thing that he says is that there's a great lyricism to the prose here. Not surprisingly, because it was written by an author who was primarily a poet. So we could add this to that great list of novels written by poets, right? And that's one of the reasons why it's memorable, why it's different, and why it's unique. It's the kind of book that stands out because of that lyricism in the style. And then I mentioned John Garrard before. I read a book by him, not a book, but a chapter of a book by him on Lermontov. So I read the chapter on a hero of our time. He tells us, I had not really realized this, I guess I was distracted, that the narration here moves from the external to the internal. So as we read, we keep getting closer and closer to Pietchorin until right in the middle of the novel, we get his journal. So we hear it straight from the horse's mouth, in other words. And that is a progressive thing that happens as we read. There is no omniscient narrator, once again. So that makes Pietchorin remain an enigma. It's a very enigmatic figure. And that, Garrard says, is maybe one of the reasons why the novel was such a scandalous event when it was published among readers. Because if we had had that third-person omniscient narrator who analyzes, who comments, who clarifies, who condemns, very importantly, then it would have been different. But because we don't have that, readers, many readers, were scandalized. But here's the thing, Lermontov wanted to remain detached from the text. He wanted to stay away from it. He wanted to be as objective as he possibly could. And that's one of the reasons why we had that scandal at the publication of this work. And that is something that actually Lermontov talks about in the preface to the entire novel. He's quite insulting, actually, of Russian readers. So that's a very important thing to keep in mind also. Garrard also says that the last story overlaps in chronology with the first one. So even though we don't have that neat structure, that typical structure of the traditional novel, it's a structure that brings us full circle because, the last one kind of continues in the first one, and we have that cyclical type of suggestion right there. There's one tiny detail that I wanted to mention also from Garrard. I was thinking, while I read the novel, Pichorin, I was wondering, does that mean something in Russian, as tends to happen sometimes with the names of characters? And it just so happens that there is an interesting thing right there. Pichorin comes from the name of a river, the river Piechora. Now, why is that important, right? Well, it's the same case with Onegin. With Onegin, we have the river Onega. So Lermontov was kind of, continuing a tradition there and maybe making a difference also that is kind of lost on me. But I thought I would mention that because I think it's an interesting detail. Bottom line, I love a hero of our time. Okay, I think I loved it when I read it the first time. I loved it the second time in a different translation. It's a sui generis work, and you can tell not only by the story but also by the structure. It doesn't seem like Lermontov was drawing from anybody. Of course, he drew a little bit from Pushkin, but he was a highly original author when it came to writing prose. At the center of this novel, we have a very complex character. Okay, he is a horrible person. We can agree on that based on his actions. But the story doesn't end there. Okay, there's much more to ponder right here with this guy Pichorin. As I was saying before, Lermontov took elements from Pushkin, but he added his own, thing to that. He developed that. And then that was something that other great Russian authors like Tolstoy, like Dostoevsky, like Chekhov, like Gogol, above all, right, would take up, and they would turn it into the great works of Russian literature that most of us know. So all I'm going to say is please read this novel. Okay, it's a quick read. It's unique. It's beautiful. I think this is one of the reading experiences that I have had with Russian literature that have left the best kind of impression on me. Now, I promised you that I would read the notes that I found here in this book. So at the very first page, somebody wrote, an acerbic, witty satire about a terrible person. It's right up your alley, and a quick read. And there's a heart drawn right there. And then at the very end, assuming, that the person that this book was given to as a gift, would read the entire thing. And by the way, I found this in a used book sale. So, I thought that was funny. I mean, if books could talk, I always think of that. If this book could tell its story, I'm just amazed by that kind of thing. And here at the very end, it says, you are already the light of my life. Every day with you is better than the last. Here's to many more. Happy birthday, my Bela, an allusion there to the name of the character. I love you with all of my heart. So just wanted to share that with you. And if I find more, in other books, I'll definitely do that because I have found some really interesting things in the books I have bought. So that's one of the perks of buying used books, I guess. Do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? Just let me know. I always enjoy reading them and doing my best to respond to your questions too. Those were my 2 cents on A Hero of Our Time by Mikhail Lermontov, which has been called by many the first great Russian novel. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.